Historians never like to say some event that occurred was inevitable, because nothing is inevitable. Um, the Civil War is one of those things that sure feels like it was inevitable, and that is because of the Constitution. As you know, the Constitution specifically enabled the system of slavery to continue in, three very specific ways. And because of that, it meant slavery as an issue would continue to arise until finally the country fractured over it. And there's obviously a geographic element to this, because geography determined where slavery would and would not succeed. Slavery didn't make any sense in the North. There were the conditions were not conducive in the North to plantation agriculture, so no need for massive labor on agricultural plantations. Just the opposite in the South. The founders thought that slavery might just sort of wither up and die within about 20 years of the founding. That obviously didn't happen. There's a lot of reasons why that didn't happen, including the development of the cotton gin and making cotton agriculture much more profitable, giving plantation owners a reason to continue the practice of slavery. So I'd like to just go over how, over the course of the 19th century, slavery as an issue kept arising, and eventually led to the Civil War. You can't really talk about slavery becoming an issue without understanding that it was slavery, but also slavery tied to expansion. So when we first set out here, we're in 1800. We've added a couple new slave states. These pink states are slave states. New Jersey continues to be a slave state in 1800. But most of the rest of the states in the North are beginning to abolish slavery. Continuing, though, what's going to happen is now we have the Louisiana Purchase. Eventually, we're going to have the Mexican Cession to add to. So the issue of slavery is really going to be a problem when we talk about expansion into new areas. Should these areas be slave or free? And initially, the idea was thought to keep a balance. As you see, in 1821, after the Missouri Compromise brought Missouri in as a slave state. Maine had been part of Massachusetts. Technically, Maine is brought in as a free state. This maintains the balance: 12 slave states, 12 free states. Even though the population is greater among these states than these states, this maintains the balance in the Senate. So it's thought that no side should really have an advantage over another side in the legislative process. Missouri Compromise also said that although Missouri is north of this parallel, 36 degrees 30, there will be no more states above this line that would have slavery. This will be tossed out with the Compromise of 1850. Here's some more expansion. After 1846, now all this that had been Mexico is now ceded to the United States, so the same issues going to arise. Should these be slave states or free states? Texas is welcomed as a state in 1845, originally part of Mexico as well. Mexico banned slavery. Mexico had abolished slavery. Slave owners from America were moving into this part of Texas to grow cotton, and soon outnumbered the Tejanos, the Mexicans that lived there, and declared a republic, and in 1845 was welcomed into the country. And that whole episode directly led to the Mexican War. In the Mexican territory ceded by Mexico after the war, create more states, including California. Nevada will be created, earn its statehood during the Civil War in 1864. part of that singer. And so by 1861, in the eruption of fighting in the Civil War, you can see it's very geographically tied. We have states in the South, deep South, hold slaves, free states up here. This is going to be the tension. And as I said, it arises over and over. And then you can see 4 of the border states, 5 if you count West Virginia, which is created during the war, 4 of these border states actually practiced slavery. It was really imperative for Abraham Lincoln to not let Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, of course, with the national capital right there, and Delaware, he had to keep them in the Union somehow, even though they were slave states. So that prevented him from really making the Civil War a war over slavery from the outset. So slavery rears its ugly head with the Missouri Compromise in 1820. Then we fight the Mexican War. All this ceded land is going to open up the debate as it's determined whether or not slavery should be there. And then in the Compromise of 1850, California is brought in as a free state. The Utah Territory and New Mexico territories are brought in under popular sovereignty, meaning the people there can vote whether or not slavery will be allowed. This is a new idea called popular sovereignty. Then in 1854, the Kansas-Nebraska Act create the territory of Kansas, which is soon going to sue for statehood, and the Nebraska Territory. And again, in both of these areas, you're going to have popular sovereignty. So the voters are actually going to vote whether or not to permit slavery. Well, it's going to create problems in Kansas right away, because Kansas is going to see slave promoters from Missouri pour across the border to vote in this election, and meanwhile abolitionists are going to send their troops from Illinois into the Kansas Territory to vote against slavery. Those two sides are going to come to blows in what becomes known as Bleeding Kansas, and the fighting really begins. In some ways, it's a warm-up act for the Civil War. Meanwhile, the slave system is thriving in the South. The economy is doing well in the South up till 1857, when there's a economic downturn that helps lead to the Civil War itself, because of the economic conditions. South becomes more desperate. So this system of slavery persists in the South. Meanwhile, Kansas becomes a battleground. Both sides are pouring people into Kansas. Fighting breaks out. As Kansas is bleeding in 1857, the Dred Scott decision comes down. You'll read that this week. And it not only endorses slavery, it says Congress does not have the constitutional power to end slavery or to make slavery illegal anywhere. So even in those states where slavery is not legal, slavery is constitutionally protected. And it goes so far as to say African Americans don't qualify as citizens. They don't have any rights under the law in the United States. Dred Scott, therefore, didn't even have the right to file this lawsuit. This decision creates great anger on the side of the abolitionists, and one of those abolitionists, a militant abolitionist, in 1859 launches a raid at a federal munitions warehouse in Harpers Ferry, Virginia, takes it over for a time, and then is caught and later executed. He becomes a hero to the North and abolitionists, and in the South, they see how he's treated as a hero in the North, and it makes them realize whether or not they're accurate, that the North is willing to send people into the South to commit violent acts against the institution of slavery. So both sides are very polarized at this side. Both sides are wary of the other side. This is essentially a tinder box that's got a lot of gasoline poured on it, and that's about to get, the flint is about to be struck. Another thing, you can't quite read all this, I guess, but it says the caning of Senator Sumner. So as all this is going on, Charles Sumner of Massachusetts gives a speech in the House of Representatives. I'm sorry, in the Senate, and later Southern senator beats him almost to death on the floor of the Senate. He's pulled out, and he takes weeks and weeks to recover until he can return to the Senate. So violence not only in Kansas but also in the halls of Congress. There it is. And then finally, that brings us to the election of 1860. The Democratic Party splits between a Southern Democrat and a Northern Democrat. Abraham Lincoln, of the newly formed Republican Party, takes advantage of that. And John Bell was a sort of a third party candidate, the Constitution Party. And the way it shakes down is, although Lincoln fails to get the popular majority, he wins the Electoral College by completely dominating in the North, and then also taking the fairly new states of California and Oregon. And then Bell does just enough to chip away at Breckinridge's strength in the South. Lincoln didn't appear on the ballot in most of these southern states. Because of Lincoln's election, the South secedes. We fight the Civil War to keep the Union together. But within the span of the Civil War, it soon turns into a struggle to emancipate the slaves. And the 13th Amendment is passed in 1865, shortly after Abraham Lincoln is assassinated.